Imagine you're walking down the street when a policeman suddenly stops you, but instead of asking you a question or checking you, he starts humiliating you, simply because you're not like him. You try to explain yourself, you try to tell the truth, but he won't listen, because he doesn't know who you are. He doesn't know that many years ago, when he was a little boy, you saved his life, and now, the one who once owed you something humiliates you in front of everyone. How do you think this story will end? Write your name and city in the comments. It's very important for us to know who you are and where you're watching from. Your comments help us move forward, develop our channel, and create new stories that touch the soul. We truly appreciate each of you. Your names are what make our channel alive. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy watching. Police sirens tore through the evening silence. A cold wind whistled between the streets, as if the night itself was trying to hold the tension in the air. A black woman in a threadbare jacket stood on the side of the road, her hands shaking slightly from the cold, but even more so from fear. She knew she had done nothing wrong. She knew she had broken no laws. But the flashing lights, the red and blue lights, the approaching white policeman made her heart pound faster. He stepped out of the car slowly, with that unwavering expression she had seen on so many before him. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who considered himself superior to others, a man accustomed to power and enjoying every bit of it, a white officer. At first he looked at her in silence, narrowing his eyes, as if searching for something in her that justified his hatred. Finally, he came closer and, not hiding his contempt, muttered, "What are you doing here? Ha!" His voice was laced with racism, as if the woman was already guilty simply because of the color of her skin. She opened her mouth to respond, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Shut up. Do you always think that you can do whatever you want?" There was aggression in his voice, mixed with mockery. He looked down at her as if she was a worthless person who didn't deserve respect. "I see right through you. You're just like the rest of them. Lazy crooks. Do you think you can live in this neighborhood and not attract attention?" Her heart pounded even faster. How many times had she experienced this? How many times had she been humiliated simply because of the way she looked? But this moment was different. The pain inside her was raging, not because he had insulted her, but because he didn't know the truth. The officer bared his teeth and stepped closer. "Why do you always think that the laws don't apply to you?" He looked at her, not expecting an answer. "Your problems are always because of your own behavior. No wonder you're here alone." He didn't know. He knew nothing. She looked down, trying to keep herself from reacting. What was the point? The world was black and white to him, and she belonged in that pitch-black darkness. He leaned toward her, bringing his face close, as if he wanted to make sure that every sentence he said cut her like a knife. "Do you think I don't know what's up with you? Do you think I don't see who you really are? But you know what? I learned to read people like you a long time ago. You can't fool me. I've known your games for a long time." Her eyes met his for a second, and there, in the depths of his icy gaze, she saw a boy, the same scared and lost boy she had once saved from the fire. But he didn't recognize her, or didn't want to. That little child had grown into a cruel man, to whom her face was now just another one. "You think the world owes you something?" he continued, grinning. "You know what you're wrong with? It's that you think any of us care about people like you." Every word he said cut to the quick. Every humiliation went deeper. She clenched her fists, trying to contain herself. The officer stepped closer, now almost touching her with his body, creating an oppressive feeling of power and control. His gaze slid over her figure, as if she were not a person, but an object. She could feel his breath, and with each new word it seemed heavier and more poisonous. "You know what I dislike most?" he said, pausing deliberately. "Your self-confidence. You always think you can get away with anything, that the world owes you something. But no, not this time." He looked her up and down, his lips curling into a mocking grin. His eyes darted to her old jacket, her tattered shoulder bag, and her worn boots. "Look at yourself." His voice was full of contempt. "Don't you even have money for normal clothes? This is your reality. You run around the streets like a rat, and you think any of us will treat you with respect? You're a nobody." She remained silent, clenching her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. The officer's words echoed in her head, and she felt the humiliation building inside her, turning into a bitter lump in her throat. Her heart pounded as if trapped, and her breathing became heavy, but she knew she couldn't show weakness, not in front of him. "Hey, are you deaf?" The policeman poked her in the shoulder, making her take a step back. "I'm talking to you." He savored the moment, dragging out the humiliation, savoring every gesture, every insult, as if it were his job, not to protect, not to serve, but to dominate, to make others feel worthless, especially those he felt had never deserved his respect. "Let's see what you have in your bag," he said, yanking it out of her hands. "I'm sure there's something interesting in there. Drugs, maybe, or stolen goods. It's always the same with people like you." She tried to protest, instinctively reaching out for her bag, but he abruptly pulled it aside, pushing her away roughly. "Don't you dare touch me," he barked, glaring at her. "You're in no position to dictate what I do, and if I find anything illegal, you'll be in trouble." He began rummaging through her bag, dumping her modest belongings onto the ground. A few small items, an old phone, a couple of notes, nothing that would confirm his suspicions, but that didn't stop him. The policeman crouched down and began kicking her things, scattering them across the sidewalk. "Oh, look at this," he said, grinning, picking up a photograph of a small boy from the ground. He turned it over, as if there was something hidden in it that he could use against her. "Who's this? Your little son? Poor guy. He probably has to live with you, put up with your miserable existence." His words hit like a hammer. She looked at the photo in his hands. It was her son, the only thing that remained bright in her life. And now this man was using even that to humiliate her. "He'll probably grow up to be just like you," the policeman continued, rising from the ground, holding the photograph outstretched as if it were something dirty. "One of those people who thinks everyone owes him something, who will always blame everyone else but himself. It runs in your family, right?" The woman felt her eyes fill with tears, but she couldn't let herself cry. Not now, not in front of him. She just looked at his face, and suddenly she wanted to scream, not from pain, but from rage, from the injustice, from how easily he could insult her. Knowing nothing about her life, not knowing that many years ago she had saved this man when he was a defenseless child. But at that moment he was far from that boy. In front of her stood a grown man, blinded by his hatred and prejudice. The policeman, clutching the photo of her son, threw it to the ground with a grin, as if it were no better than trash. The woman's eyes darted to the picture, and something inside her clenched. He was not just humiliating her, he was trampling everything she held dear. But he did not stop. Seeing her tense face in silence, the officer only grinned wider, pleased with his strength and power over her. His eyes sparkled with a cold fire, as if he was enjoying the fear and dejection in her gaze. "Look at you," he began again, his voice like poison dripping into her soul. "You just stand there and can't say anything. You," he paused deliberately, emphasizing the word, "are always like this, just noise and accusations, but as soon as you come up against real power, you shut up. You're afraid, aren't you?" He took a step forward, hovering over her, almost touching her with his body. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that if she made one wrong move, said the wrong thing, it could all end badly. She had seen it before. She had seen the news where people like her were suspected simply for breathing. She had seen them brutally beaten, arrested, and then nothing happened. No one was punished. No one was found guilty, because the system was built on people like him, people who thought they could do whatever they wanted. "Do you know what your problem is?" he continued, his voice quieter but no less menacing. "You all think you deserve the same respect as everyone else. Think we're all equal? No way." He narrowed his eyes, a glint of malice in them. "You're not like me. You never will be. I've seen hundreds like you. You can walk around with your head held high. You can talk about your rights, but you'll always be at the bottom of this system. And you know why? Because you're nothing." He poked her in the shoulder again, making her step back. His words were like a whip, each one leaving deep, invisible wounds. "And you will never understand it. You don't even try. All you do is complain. Oh, we are poorly understood. Oh, we are oppressed. You don't even have anything to complain about. You live in a free country, but all you do is look for excuses for your insignificance." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had seen that look many times before, heard those insults many times, but today, in front of this man, it felt different. She knew him, even though he didn't recognize her. He was the boy she had pulled from the burning house, and now he treated her like a criminal. "I look at you and I see only a problem," he said, finally throwing her bag on the ground. "A problem that doesn't even realize that it lives because of us. If it weren't for people like me, you wouldn't be here, but you're not grateful. You and people like you are always looking for reasons to complain. You think someone is going to solve your problems? Ridiculous." He turned his back to her as if he was already finished with her, but then turned around abruptly, meeting her gaze again. "Do you know why I do this?" he asked with a bitter smile. "Because I can. Because no one deserves more than you. You are worthless." His words were spoken with special cruelty, as if he wanted to break her completely with each one. "You can scream about injustice all you want, but it won't change anything. No one will defend you. No one will stand by your side, because people like you are always alone." She was silent, holding back tears. Emotions raged inside her: anger, pain, helplessness, and with it, a subtle sense of bitterness. Her life had always been a fight for respect, for justice, a fight against a system that had been against her from the start. And now, standing before the man who represented everything that was wrong with this world, she felt that every blow, every humiliation, was only part of a larger story. He wasn't the first person to speak to her like this, and he might not be the last. The policeman took a step forward, and she felt the ground shift beneath her. He loomed over her, angry, confident in his power, in the fact that he could get away with it. "You'll remember this moment," he said, his voice low and cold. "You'll remember standing here in front of me, unable to do anything, because that's how it should be. Your place is beneath my feet." The officer was escalating the situation, as if he was enjoying her helplessness. He stepped forward again, forcing her to retreat once more. There were no more than a few centimeters between them now, and she could feel his breath on her face, his voice low and filled with contempt. "You don't understand, do you? You're not here because I just stopped you. You're here because you belong at the bottom. People like you will never rise higher. And the sooner you understand that, the easier your life will be." He slowly moved his hand to his belt, where the baton hung. Without drawing it, he let his fingers lightly touch the handle, and that was enough to create a sense of menace. He was ready to use force at any moment, and she knew it. She had no choice but to submit to his authority, accepting her humiliation. "Why are you silent?" His voice became rougher. "Where are your cries for rights? Where are your speeches about freedom? Ha! You're just like the rest of them, always complaining about racism, about oppression. Come on, say something, give me a reason." Her thoughts froze, as if the entire world had narrowed to this moment, to these humiliations he heaped on her. She couldn't respond, not because she had no words, but because she understood how dangerous this man was. He wasn't just a cop, he was the embodiment of the entire system that had always been against her. His every look, his every word was saturated with hatred, coming not from him alone, but from dozens, hundreds of others like him who had been trying to corner her entire life. But now, in this moment, it all felt stronger than ever. "I don't see you saying anything," he continued, and there was a sinister mockery in his voice. "You're one of those people who always demand something, but when it comes to real power, suddenly you shut up. That's because you know your place, right? You know that I can do whatever I want to you, and no one will say a word. No one will come to your aid, because no one cares about people like you." He slowly straightened up, now towering over her completely. At that moment, his figure seemed colossal, oppressive, filling all the space. He enjoyed every moment, every trembling look, every attempt to hide her fear, and she continued to stand, not moving, knowing that any movement could become a pretext for aggression. "I could arrest you right now," he said, grinning as he touched the handcuffs on his belt. "You think I wouldn't find a reason? You think it'll be that hard? In your case, all you have to do is want to. You know what happens then? You'll end up in jail, and there will be more of me waiting for you, and no one will be on your side, because we make the world a safer place by getting rid of trash." He said the word trash with a special contempt, as if he was trying to penetrate her soul and trample it. Her chest tightened from his words, from the realization that for him she was just dirt, that he really believed what he was saying, and most importantly, that he had the power to carry out his threats. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood today," he continued with a fake smile. "But who knows what tomorrow will bring? Maybe tomorrow I won't be so merciful." He took a step back, as if deliberately giving her space, but the movement only increased his power, emphasizing that he was in complete control of the situation. The woman felt her legs shaking, but she knew she could not show weakness. Any weakness would be a signal to him that she was broken, that he had achieved his goal. "You're only here because we let you be here," he said, his voice cold and hard again. But don't forget, that could change at any moment. One word, and your life could be turned upside down. You think anyone in this world will protect you? You're wrong. No one will. Not when there's people like me on the other side. We always win. He grinned and turned slowly toward his car, as if he had decided he had had enough fun for the day. But before he climbed into the patrol car, he cast one last glance over his shoulder, a dark threat in his voice. Remember this when you think you have rights, because people like you have no rights. He opened the car door and got behind the wheel, leaving her standing in the middle of the street, amid scattered belongings and trampled photographs, feeling as if she had been crushed. His words continued to ring in her head like cold blows, each one cutting deeper into her consciousness. She tried to collect her thoughts, but fear and anger overwhelmed her. It felt like this man had destroyed everything she had ever considered important, leaving her feeling completely helpless. The flashing lights slowly disappeared into the distance, and her gaze stopped on the photograph of her son, trampled and dirty. The woman stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, and time seemed to have stopped. The officer, sitting behind the wheel of his patrol car, still hadn't driven away. He continued to stare at her through the glass, like a predator looking for its prey. There was nothing in his gaze except contempt and pleasure in her suffering. She understood that he was not just a policeman, but the personification of the entire system that oppressed her daily. As if sensing her fear, he leaned forward to get a better look at her. His face came closer to the glass, and she suddenly felt a cold fear run down her spine. It was as if he was looking for every emotion, every thought that might give her away. "You're still here," he said, his voice mocking. "I thought you knew by now that you had no place in this world, but it seems you still haven't learned your lesson. Or are you just afraid I'll follow you and you can't leave?" She barely heard his words, only felt the fear filling her, making her even more vulnerable. Anger raged inside her, but with it came utter helplessness. She couldn't let herself show that he had gotten his way, that his words had pierced her. "You know what happens if I get out of the car?" he continued, opening the door and standing up. "I could make your life a living hell. One wrong move, and I'll find a way to arrest you. I always will. In your case, it could be as simple as saying you were aggressive, or that you threatened me. Does that sound familiar? You've heard that, right?" He took a step toward her, and she felt herself retreating again, instinctively moving back. Every word he said was like a knife, cutting deeper into her soul. He skillfully used her fear to justify his power. She felt that he was enjoying her confusion, as if every step and word he took was an affirmation of his superiority. "You know that when I was little, I was surrounded by people like you," he said, frowning as if remembering something. "Every time I heard you scream, your complaints, I found it funny. You think you're doing something important, but in reality, you're just wasting air. I always felt sorry for you, because you'll never understand how this world works." She felt her body go rigid. He wasn't just belittling her as a person, he was delving into her identity, her race, and every comment he made was a blow to her dignity. She felt helpless and alone, like the world had gone mad and no one was on her side. "I could make it so you never leave this area at all," he continued, looking around the empty street. "I could call for backup, and they'd be here in minutes. Think about it. What would it be like to be in that situation? The sky above you, and dozens of eyes watching you fall to the bottom." He came even closer, and she felt panic rising in her. He was close, too close, and fear was overwhelming her. She knew his only goal was to humiliate and intimidate her. She felt her legs give way, and she gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stand up straight. "Well, are you going to say something, or are you just going to stand there like a statue?" His voice became even more sullen. "You don't want me to think you agree with this, do you? Or do you?" She decided that she could not bear it any longer. A storm was raging inside her, and, gathering her courage, she finally said, "I'm not afraid of you." These words sounded like a challenge, and she herself was surprised at her own courage. But the officer only grinned, and his face was distorted with malice. "Oh, how sweet," he said, tilting his head. "Do you really believe that? Are you not afraid? How touching. But you, like everyone else, have long since realized that the world is not as simple as you want it to be. In fact, you are at rock bottom, and when you realize that, when you reach rock bottom, then you will be truly afraid." He stepped closer to her, and in that moment the air around them became heavy with tension. Every step he took felt like a threat, and his eyes burned with an unquenchable fire of hatred. She wanted to step back, to run, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground. "You can't just walk away from this," he said, as if reading her mind. "You'll always be a reminder of your shortcomings. You'll never be able to hide from your history. And when the time comes, you'll realize the world won't change for you." She looked at him, trying not to show it, but a wave of rage was rising inside her. The feeling of helplessness became unbearable. He was trying to break her, but in that moment, when he stood before her, she realized that she could not let him win. This was not just a clash of two people, it was a clash of worldviews, two lives that intersected in that moment. "You don't know who I am," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. "You don't know what I've been through, and you don't know what I've done to survive. You can't put me down, because I'm more than you can imagine." The officer froze, his eyes wide with surprise. She felt the tension in the air shift, as if the boldness in her voice had momentarily thrown him off balance, but he quickly recovered, and his face filled with hatred once more. "You thought you could scare me?" he said, and there was fury in his voice. "You're the one who's scared now. You just don't realize what I can do to you. You don't see that this courage is just a mask. You're not getting out of here until I want you to." In that moment, the woman realized that this wasn't just a battle for her dignity. This was a battle for her life, for her future, and she couldn't let him get the better of her. Her eyes met his, and she saw not only hatred in them, but fear of losing control, fear that she might actually be stronger than he thought. "I'm not alone," she said, her voice growing stronger, "and don't forget that the world is changing. You can't just suppress us forever. We'll fight, and I'll fight. You can't take this power from me." With every word she said, the tension grew, and at that moment they both realized that the battle was not over yet. The officer standing before her froze for a moment. There was an expression in his eyes that she couldn't immediately decipher, a mixture of surprise and irritation, but she felt that in that very moment, something had changed. A struggle began inside him, as if his own words had come back to him in his face, forcing him to wonder who he was humiliating. "You think you can talk to me like you have some kind of power?" he said, his voice growing more tense, but at the same time, something new was happening inside him. He was trying to maintain control, but his confidence was cracking at the seams. The woman felt that right now. When he looked at her with such doubt, she was one step closer to changing the course of this meeting. It was as if a dark cloud had hung over him, and without knowing it, he began to realize that by humiliating her, he was not just causing pain, he was already making a mistake that would haunt him. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she said, her voice harder than ever. "You don't know what I've been through, and the walls I had to break down to get to where I am today. Do you think you can just ignore all the pain you cause others?" He turned away, as if he didn't want to hear her words, but there was a feeling growing inside him that he couldn't ignore. It was like a small spark had flared up in his mind, reminding him of a childhood memory. It was like images had surfaced somewhere in the depths of his memory, images of a dark alley, of screaming in fear, when he, a little boy, was alone with a threat, and at that moment someone came to his aid. "I can see how you're trying to intimidate me," she said, catching his eye. "But don't forget that behind every humiliation there's a story. Your story isn't as simple as you think, either." The officer gritted his teeth, his hand shaking slightly as he touched his belt again, but just as he was about to continue his threats, doubt gripped him. What if this woman was more than just a random victim? What if she was an important part of his past after all? His childhood fears began to surface again, causing him to feel the guilt he had been trying to forget all these years. "You can't intimidate me," she repeated, as if she sensed his weakness. "I know what it's like to be afraid. I know what it's like to lose everything, but I stayed on my feet. I'm here to show you that your hatred won't break me." At that moment, something clicked in his head. He remembered that day when he was a small, scared boy. He remembered being surrounded by bullies, losing hope, alone cry in the darkness. And this woman, she was there. She came to his aid when no one else would. She had saved him, and now he was humiliating her. The realization pierced him like a cold knife. The officer recoiled as if her words had torn his inner world apart. He couldn't believe that he was treating the woman who had essentially saved his life so rudely. He felt ashamed of his aggression, of his hateful words, of having sunk to such a level. "Wait," he said, his voice much quieter and more confused. "Wait a minute. You couldn't be that woman from that day?" She looked at him, puzzled. His tone had changed, and his confidence seemed to have vanished, like a shadow dissolving in the light. He no longer looked like an aggressive cop, but rather like a scared man facing his own demons. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, trying to understand what was happening, but a new wave of hope rose inside her. Maybe she really had gotten through to him? You were there, when I was little. You saved me." His voice shook, and she saw him trying to process the weight of his words. The realization flashed in his eyes that he was not just pursuing someone else's life. He had betrayed the one who had once come to his aid. She stood frozen in surprise, realizing that his words carried more than she could have imagined. It was as if the world around them had changed, and now what was at stake was not only her humiliation, but also the possibility of changing perceptions. "You don't know what I've been through since you were little," she said, her voice less tense but still full of emotion. "I live with what you just said. I know how easy it is to fall into darkness, and I know that there's no need to hate." His eyes filled with tears as he remembered what had happened in his childhood, and his heart sank with shame. He couldn't believe that he had fallen so low, humiliating the one who had once saved him. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was so blind. I didn't see. I didn't want to see." The woman standing before him felt that in that moment the world was beginning to change. It was no longer just a battle between oppression and resistance. It was an opportunity for healing, an opportunity to show that even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found. "We can change this," she said, her voice full of hope. "We can start with ourselves. I don't want this to happen again. I don't want more hate." The officer looked at her hopefully, his heart beginning to beat in unison with her words. He realized that in her presence, he was no longer a police officer, but simply a man confronted with his own past. This was a moment when they could both learn from each other, when they could change their fates. "I want to change that," he said with new determination. "I want to right my wrongs." The woman felt her heart fill with light as she realized that a spark of hope had finally ignited in their hearts. This moment of realization was the beginning of something new, and they both knew it would be a long journey, but they were ready to walk it together. The officer, standing before the woman, felt his inner world begin to change. All the anger and hatred he had carried with him seemed to dissolve under the pressure of her words. He realized that his actions were not just a mistake, they were a reflection of his fears and prejudices. It was as if a heavy curtain covering his eyes from the truth was slowly falling away. "I didn't know," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I didn't understand how my words could hurt. I thought I was defending order, but in reality I was just stirring up hatred." The woman looked at him with understanding, but also with caution. She saw that he had sincere feelings, but in her heart there was still a shadow of pain from the humiliations he had caused. Her anger subsided, and in its place came understanding. Perhaps he really did not understand the depth of his actions. "Sometimes we all lack awareness of what we do," she said. "You weren't the only one who suffered from bias. I do too, and I have to fight it every day." He sighed, as if trying to release all the poison that had built up over the years. He thought of his childhood fears, of the day she had come to his aid. Now he understood that it had not been just a rescue, it had been an opportunity to see the world differently, an opportunity for change. "When I was little, I remember you saving me," he continued, his voice calmer but still full of emotion. "I never thought that moment would have such an impact on me. I've always lived with hatred and fear, and it made me who I am. But you opened my eyes to something bigger." His words, full of remorse, seemed to pierce the atmosphere around them. She could see that he genuinely wanted to change his behavior, and this was part of his healing. However, she still needed time to forgive him for the pain he had caused her. "I was blind, and now it tears me apart," he said, his voice growing quieter. "I thought I could humiliate you, but in reality I was humiliating myself. I lost everything that was valuable, and now I realize that your life is not just something I can ignore." She felt his words begin to awaken hope in her. It was like a gentle touch to her heart, and despite all the pain, she knew that now, perhaps, she could give him a chance. "I can't forget what happened," she said carefully, "but I can learn to forgive. It won't be simple, and it won't be easy, but if you're sincere in your desire to change, I'm ready to support you." His eyes filled with tears and he nodded, accepting her words. He felt a new hope begin to emerge in his soul, and this was the first step toward healing, for both him and her. "I am ready to do everything to change my life and show that I can be better," he said, his voice growing strong. "I want to correct my mistakes and learn to look at the world with understanding, not with prejudice. I understand that this will be a long road, but I am ready to go through it." The woman felt her heart fill with light. It was more than just remorse, it was a desire for change, an opportunity to change the world around her. She understood that true strength does not come from suppressing others, but from the ability to open up and learn from your own mistakes. "We can start with small steps," she suggested, her voice softening. "We can talk to people, share our stories, help others understand that hate is not the answer. It will be a hard road, but it will be worth it." The officer nodded. His heart swelled with gratitude. He saw in her not only a victim, but also a strong woman who was ready to change. This was a chance not only for him, but for her as well. A chance to unite and fight for something greater. "I can never take back what I did, but I can do everything to make sure it doesn't happen again," he said, his voice full of determination. "I will work on myself. I will listen. I will learn." The woman felt her anger finally fading. She realized that in this world, it was possible to find understanding and support, even among those who had once caused her pain. She was willing to give him a chance, but she also understood that it would take time. "Thank you for opening up," she said, smiling, though her heart was still full of emotion. "We all make mistakes, and it's important to learn from those mistakes." At that moment, they both knew that this was just the beginning of a journey full of difficulties and trials, but with hope for a bright future, where hatred would have no power, and understanding and support would become the basis of their new life. The officer took a deep breath, his heart pounding with confusion and shame. He knew he had to take this step to apologize sincerely. He looked at the woman, who, despite everything, continued to look at him with understanding and a willingness to engage in dialogue. She was strong, and in that moment he felt her strength as never before. "I have something important to tell you," he began, his voice shaking but trying to sound confident. "I came here not only as a police officer, but as a person who did something terrible. I want to apologize for hurting you." The woman, standing in front of him, felt his words touch her heart. She looked at him, trying to see sincerity in his eyes, and at that moment she noticed a spark of remorse in his gaze. "I allowed my hatred and prejudice to cloud my humanity," he continued, his voice becoming more determined. "I humiliated you without realizing that behind every word there is someone's feelings, and that cannot be an excuse." He took a step closer, and she noticed his lips trembling and his eyes filling with tears. It wasn't just an apology, it was an attempt to open his heart and show that he realized his mistakes. "I remembered the day you saved me," he said, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "I was just a child, scared and alone. You came to my aid, and now I see how I became a source of fear for others." The woman remained silent, her heart filled with conflicting feelings. She wanted to believe in his sincerity, but the wounds caused by his words were still open. "I can't take back what I've done," he said, his eyes genuinely seeking forgiveness, "but I promise I'll do everything I can to change myself and my life. I want to learn and grow, and I want you to know that I'm truly remorseful." In that moment, she realized that his words could be the beginning of something new. She saw that he was not simply asking for forgiveness. He was seeking to understand and change his behavior. Her anger began to subside, giving way to a new feeling, hope that even the most painful mistakes could be corrected. "I want you to know that your words mean a lot to me," she said, her voice softening. "I can't forget what happened, but I'm willing to give you a chance to show that you've changed." The officer nodded, realizing that this was not just a moment, but an opportunity for healing. He felt his own tears begin to fall as he realized that this apology was a step toward releasing his own demons. "Thank you," he said with genuine gratitude. "I know it's going to be a long road, but I'm willing to take it. I want to be better not only for myself, but for those I've hurt in the past." With each word he spoke, the woman felt her heart fill with light. They stood there in silence, understanding that this was an important moment that could change not only their lives, but the lives of many others. The officer and the woman stood face to face, exchanging glances of hope and understanding. There was a new energy in the air that seemed to fill the space between them with light. They both knew that this conversation was the beginning of something bigger, an opportunity to change themselves and the world around them. "I want to start with small steps," the woman said, her voice growing more confident. "We can work together to change perceptions so that others too begin to understand that hatred and prejudice are not the way. I am willing to help you if you are sincere in your intentions." The officer nodded, his heart brimming with gratitude and determination. He knew it wouldn't be an easy path, but now that he stood before her, he felt he could handle any difficulty. I'm willing to do anything to help the people around me and learn from them, he replied. I want to be a voice for change, not a silent witness to injustice. The woman smiled, and a spark of hope appeared in her eyes. She knew this was just the beginning, but in her soul there was a feeling that they could do something meaningful together. Let's start with communication, she suggested. We'll share our stories, talk to people, let's organize meetings so that people can open up and understand each other. The officer nodded, enthusiasm shining in his eyes. He saw how important this job was, and he was ready to put all his efforts into it. I will be your ally, he said with determination. We will be together, and I promise that I will do everything in my power to support this initiative. So they started working on their plans, together. They organized meetings, bringing together people from different communities. Each meeting became a platform for dialogue, where people could share their experiences, their fears and hopes. Over time, they saw how perceptions changed, how hatred and prejudice gave way to understanding and empathy. A real transformation began to happen in their town. People began to open up, to remove the barriers that separated them. The officer became more than just a cop. He became an activist who used his platform to speak out about the importance of equality and justice. The woman became an inspiration, showing that even in the darkest of times, there is light to be found. One day, at the end of a meeting, when the crowd had dispersed, they were left alone. The officer turned to her with a sincere smile. You know, I never thought I could change, but now I see that everything is possible when you have support. Thank you for opening my eyes. She responded with a smile full of happiness and satisfaction. It was a journey for both of us. We did it together, and I believe we can continue to do so. Each of us has the power to change the world, starting with ourselves. In that moment, they both realized that despite their past mistakes and biases, they could create a future full of hope and understanding. It was not just a story of remorse, but also of the possibility of changing the world for the better, of the strength they found in each other. From that day forward, they became allies in the fight for justice, each step forward bringing new opportunities to learn and grow. Together, they paved the way for a brighter future, inspiring others to follow their example. And in their hearts, hope was ignited that together they could overcome any obstacle and create a world where understanding, respect, and equality reign for all. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the story. We are very interested to know what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? How did you cope with such situations? Write about it in the comments. Your opinion is important to us. Each of you is very important to us, and we appreciate each of you. You are our support and inspiration. If you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. Have a nice day and hope to see you again.